Karen sent fake HOA cops to arrest me, but I'm a U.S. Marshal. U.S. Marshal Jack Stratton thought he was retiring to a peaceful life in Oakwood Terrace. He was wrong. HOA President Karen Doyle ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, issuing fines for the slightest infractions. But Karen had a secret, a dark side hustle that went far beyond petty rules. And she was about to learn that she'd picked the wrong homeowner to harass. Jack wasn't just retired. He was ready. U.S. Marshal Jack Stratton had seen his share of trouble. 20 years in law enforcement, most of them spent tracking down fugitives, had taught him to read people, to anticipate danger, to trust his gut. But as he turned onto Maple Drive, the main street of the Oakwood Terrace community, he felt a sense of, well, if not peace, then at least a welcome respite. He was 48, recently reassigned to a desk job at the regional office, a move he'd requested, a change of pace he desperately needed. The constant pressure, the adrenaline rush, the ever-present threat of violence, it had taken its toll. He was looking for quiet, for normalcy, for a place to simply be. He'd found this house online, a modest but well-maintained 3-bedroom ranch with a large backyard and a 2-car garage. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, dependable, and, most importantly, it was in a quiet neighborhood, far from the city's hustle and bustle. He'd done his research, checked the crime rates, read the community reviews. Oakwood Terrace seemed like the perfect place to decompress, to recharge, to start a new chapter. A place where the biggest concern was supposed to be whether the neighbors remembered to bring in their trash cans on time. The neighborhood itself was a picture of suburban tranquility. Neat rows of houses, each with a carefully manicured lawn, lined the streets. Mature oak trees provided ample shade, their leaves rustling gently in the afternoon breeze. American flags fluttered from front porches, and flower boxes overflowed with colorful blooms. It was the kind of place that real estate agents described as family-friendly and move-in ready. A place where people waved to each other from their driveways and gathered for weekend barbecues. But beneath the surface, Jack sensed a certain rigidity, a conformity that felt a little too enforced, a little too perfect. The houses were all variations on the same theme: brick or siding, shutters or no shutters, neutral colors, approved landscaping. It was as if the entire community had been designed from a template, a pre-packaged version of the American dream. He wondered if free thought was included. His first direct interaction with the HOA, or rather its self-appointed queen, came just 2 days after he'd moved in. He was in his front yard, inspecting the sprinkler system, a crucial task in the dry Missouri summers, when a golf cart, electric and eerily silent, pulled up to the curb. Behind the wheel was a woman in her late 50s, with a helmet of blonde hair, a tightly set mouth, and eyes that seemed to assess him like a potential security threat. She wore a bright pink polo shirt with the Oakwood Terrace logo embroidered on the chest, and a pair of white slacks that looked impeccably pressed. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. "I'm Karen Doyle, the president of the Oakwood Terrace Homeowners Association. Welcome to the neighborhood." Jack straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Thanks," he said, offering a polite smile. "Jack Stratton." "We're so glad to have you," Karen continued, her gaze sweeping over his yard, his house, his truck parked in the driveway. "We're a very close-knit community here. We like to keep things nice and tidy. We have standards, you know." Jack nodded, already anticipating the inevitable lecture. He'd dealt with HOAs before, and he knew they could be a breeding ground for petty power struggles and arbitrary rules. "I understand," he said. "I appreciate that." "We have a welcome packet for new residents," Karen said, reaching into a basket attached to the golf cart. She pulled out a thick folder, bound with a plastic comb, and handed it to him. It contains all the HOA rules and regulations, the bylaws, the architectural guidelines, everything you need to know to be a good neighbor. Jack took the packet, its weight surprisingly substantial. He flipped through it briefly, noting the dense text, the numerous diagrams, the endless list of do's and don'ts. It looked more like a legal contract than a welcome guide. "We're very particular about landscaping here," Karen added, her eyes fixed on a patch of slightly uneven grass near the sidewalk. "We like to maintain a certain aesthetic, uniformity, curb appeal. It's important for property values. Jack followed her gaze, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. He'd mowed the lawn just yesterday, but apparently it wasn't quite up to Oakwood Terrace standards. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, his voice neutral. Karen's smile tightened slightly. "And we also have rules about exterior modifications," she continued, her gaze shifting to his truck, a well-maintained but slightly older model Ford F-150. "We encourage residents to park their vehicles in the garage whenever possible. It keeps the streets looking cleaner, more organized." Jack felt a flicker of annoyance. He preferred to park his truck in the driveway for convenience. And it was his driveway, after all. He'd specifically chosen a property not governed by an HOA when house hunting, but the real estate agent had assured him this one was mostly for show, and the fees were low. "I'll take that into consideration," he said, his voice still polite, but with a hint of steel. Karen seemed to sense his resistance. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mr. Stratton," she said, "we like to think of ourselves as a proactive community. We address problems before they become bigger problems. It's all about maintaining harmony, you see." Harmony, Jack thought, or control? He had a feeling he knew which one Karen Doyle valued more. He received a small yellow envelope in his mailbox the following afternoon, his first official HOA violation. He knew it wouldn't be his last. The yellow envelope was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Jack Stratton's mailbox became a repository for Karen Doyle's increasingly absurd and fabricated HOA violations. It started with the seemingly minor, a warning for having his trash cans out on the curb for an extra hour after pickup. He'd been called in to work unexpectedly. Then came a citation for unapproved landscaping, specifically, a small patch of wildflowers he'd planted near the back fence, a splash of color he'd thought would brighten up the otherwise monotonous expanse of green lawn. Next, it was his mailbox. Apparently, the standard-issue black mailbox that had come with the house was now not in compliance with updated community guidelines. He received a notice demanding that he replace it with a specific model, available only from a pre-approved vendor, at a cost of nearly $200. Jack, a man who had faced down armed criminals, found himself increasingly infuriated by these petty, power-hungry dictates. He tried to reason with Karen. He called her, politely explaining that his mailbox was perfectly functional, that his wildflowers were hardly a threat to property values, and that he had a legitimate reason for occasionally being delayed in retrieving his trash cans. Her responses were always the same: dismissive, condescending, and laced with thinly veiled threats. "Mr. Stratton," she'd say, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "the rules are the rules. We have to maintain standards. We can't have everyone just doing whatever they want. It's for the good of the community." He tried attending an HOA board meeting, hoping to appeal to reason, to find some common ground. He quickly realized that the board was a rubber stamp for Karen's whims. They were a collection of timid retirees and bored housewives, completely under her thumb, unwilling to challenge her authority or question her decisions. The meeting was a farce, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to give the illusion of democracy while maintaining Karen's iron grip on power. Jack began to feel like he was living in a bizarre, Kafkaesque nightmare, where the rules were constantly changing, the violations were arbitrary, and the only constant was Karen Doyle's relentless pursuit of control. He started documenting everything: the violation notices, the emails, the phone calls, the encounters with Karen. He kept a detailed log, noting the dates, times, and specific details of each incident. He was building a case, not just against Karen, but against the entire system she represented. He also started talking to his neighbors, discreetly, cautiously. He discovered that he wasn't alone. Many of them had similar stories of Karen's overreach, her petty tyrannies, her selective enforcement of rules. They whispered about exorbitant fines, about liens placed on properties for minor infractions, about neighbors who had been forced to sell their homes after being targeted by Karen. But most were afraid to speak out publicly, fearing retaliation. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, told him about how Karen had fined her repeatedly for having unapproved garden gnomes in her front yard. Another, a young couple with 2 small children, recounted how Karen had threatened to call Child Protective Services because their kids' toys were sometimes left on the lawn. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a systematic abuse of power that had been going on for years. Jack learned that Karen had been president of the Oakwood Terrace HOA for over a decade, and during that time she had consolidated her power, eliminating any opposition and creating a culture of fear and intimidation. She ruled the neighborhood like a petty dictator, using the HOA bylaws as her weapon of choice, and she seemed to enjoy it, to relish the control she wielded over her neighbors' lives. The whispers about Jack started to circulate. He noticed the sideways glances, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached. Karen, he suspected, was spreading rumors, painting him as a troublemaker, a rebel, someone who didn't respect the rules, someone who threatened the harmony of Oakwood Terrace. She was isolating him, turning his neighbors against him, making him an outsider in his own community. Then came the final notice. It arrived in a certified letter, a thick envelope with the words, "Legal action pending," stamped in bold red letters across the front. Inside was a formal demand for payment of over $1,500 in outstanding fines, along with a threat to place a lien on his property if he didn't comply within 30 days. The violations listed were a laundry list of fabricated offenses, ranging from improperly stored garden tools to failure to maintain uniform lawn color. Jack stared at the letter, his anger simmering. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was extortion. Karen was trying to steal his money, to threaten his home, to force him into submission. She had crossed a line. And he was done playing nice. He knew that reasoning with her was pointless. He knew that appealing to the HOA board was a waste of time. He needed a different strategy. He needed to fight fire with fire. He needed to use his skills, his knowledge, his experience to expose Karen's corruption and bring her down. He was a U.S. Marshal, after all. He was trained to deal with criminals, and Karen Doyle, he realized, was nothing more than a petty criminal, hiding behind the facade of a homeowners association. It was time to bring her to justice. Jack Stratton had spent his career dealing with dangerous criminals, drug traffickers, arms dealers, violent fugitives. He'd faced down threats far more serious than a power-hungry HOA president. But there was something about Karen Doyle's relentless harassment, her smug sense of entitlement, her blatant disregard for the law that ignited a particular kind of fury within him. This wasn't just about HOA rules, it was about principle. It was about justice. And he wasn't going to let her get away with it. He decided to use his skills, his training, his resources to fight back. He wasn't just a homeowner, he was a U.S. Marshal, with access to databases, investigative techniques, and a network of contacts in law enforcement. He would treat Karen Doyle like any other suspect, gathering evidence, building a case, and preparing for a confrontation. He started by meticulously documenting every interaction with Karen, every violation notice, every email, every phone call. He organized the information chronologically, creating a detailed timeline of her harassment. He analyzed the HOA bylaws, comparing them to state law, identifying numerous instances where Karen had overstepped her authority, violated homeowners' rights, and potentially broken the law herself. He then turned his attention to the financial aspect. He suspected that Karen wasn't just power-hungry, she was also greedy. He requested copies of the HOA's financial records, citing his rights as a homeowner. Karen, predictably, stonewalled him, claiming that the records were confidential and unavailable for review. But Jack was prepared for that. He sent a formal demand letter, citing specific state statutes that mandated transparency and homeowner access to HOA financial information. He gave her a deadline, and he threatened legal action if she failed to comply. While he waited for Karen's response, or lack thereof, Jack started digging online. He used his law enforcement databases, resources not available to the general public, to run background checks on Karen Doyle and the other members of the HOA board. He wasn't looking for minor traffic violations. He was looking for patterns of suspicious activity, for financial irregularities, for any hint of criminal behavior. He also discreetly contacted some of his colleagues in law enforcement, seeking advice and potential assistance. He spoke to a friend in the FBI, an expert in financial crimes, and another in the local police department, a detective who specialized in fraud investigations. He didn't reveal his identity as a U.S. Marshal initially, wanting to gauge their unbiased assessment of the situation. He simply presented the facts, the evidence he'd gathered, and asked for their professional opinion. The responses he received were encouraging. Both his FBI contact and the local detective agreed that Karen's actions raised serious red flags. The fabricated violations, the excessive fines, the threats of legal action, the resistance to transparency, it all pointed to a potential pattern of fraud and extortion. They encouraged him to continue his investigation and offered their support if needed. Jack also discovered something else during his online research. Karen Doyle had a history. Not a criminal record per se, but a pattern of complaints and lawsuits filed against her in previous neighborhoods where she'd lived. She'd been accused of harassment, of misusing HOA funds, of engaging in petty feuds with her neighbors. She'd always managed to weasel her way out of trouble, either by settling out of court or by simply moving on to a new community, a new target. He began to connect with some of the neighbors. He started that endeavor by revisiting some who had hinted at issues with Karen and the HOA. Jack also delved into the security company Karen used, the two men from before. He was sure they were not legitimate law enforcement. He ran their names through his databases, and the results were shocking. The company, Oakwood Security Services, was a shell corporation, with no physical address, no listed employees, and no legitimate business license. The two men, Rick and Doug, had criminal records, including charges for assault, theft, and impersonating a police officer. They were thugs, hired by Karen to intimidate and harass residents, to enforce her arbitrary rules, and to collect her bogus fines. He had them. He had Karen, Rick, and Doug. He had evidence of fraud, extortion, impersonation of law enforcement, and a pattern of harassment that spanned years. He had a case that could put Karen Doyle behind bars, dismantle her corrupt HOA, and bring justice to the residents of Oakwood Terrace. But he needed to be strategic. He couldn't just storm into the next HOA meeting and accuse Karen of being a criminal. He needed to present his evidence in a way that was irrefutable, that would force the authorities to take action, and that would protect him and his neighbors from retaliation. He decided to use Karen's own tactics against her. He would create a final notice, a meticulously documented report outlining her crimes, supported by irrefutable evidence, and delivered with the full weight of his authority as a U.S. Marshal. He would give her one last chance to confess, to resign, to make amends. And if she refused, he would unleash the full force of the law upon her. He spent the next few days drafting the report, working late into the night, meticulously organizing the evidence, citing relevant statutes, and crafting a narrative that was both compelling and legally sound. He included copies of the fabricated violation notices, the financial records he'd managed to obtain, the background checks on Karen, Rick, and Doug, and sworn statements from several neighbors who had been victimized by Karen's schemes. He also prepared a separate package for the local police department, the district attorney's office, and the U.S. attorney's office, outlining the potential criminal charges against Karen and her accomplices. He knew that involving multiple agencies would increase the pressure on Karen and ensure that the case was taken seriously. He was ready. He had the evidence, he had the plan, and he had the authority. He was no longer just a homeowner fighting a petty HOA president. He was a U.S. Marshal, upholding the law, protecting his community, and bringing a criminal to justice. Karen Doyle had picked the wrong fight, and she was about to find out just how wrong she was. He was prepared for a long battle, if necessary. He printed out multiple copies of the material and prepared envelopes. He was ready to deliver the news. He placed the documents back in his briefcase. He double-checked his weapon and put on a fresh shirt. It was time. Jack Stratton knew that timing was everything. He could have simply reported Karen Doyle to the authorities, handed over his evidence, and let the legal process unfold. But he wanted something more. He wanted to confront her directly. to expose her corruption in front of her peers, to give her one last chance to confess and make amends, and if she refused, to ensure that her downfall was swift and decisive. He wanted a public reckoning. He chose the next HOA meeting as his stage. He knew Karen would be there, holding court, basking in her perceived power. He knew the other board members would be present, along with a handful of residents, most of them likely too intimidated to challenge Karen's authority. It was the perfect opportunity to expose her lies, to dismantle her facade, and to reclaim the community from her grasp. He arrived at the meeting early, dressed not in his Marshal's uniform but in plain clothes. Jeans, a polo shirt, and a casual jacket. He wanted to appear unassuming, non-threatening, at least initially. He carried a briefcase containing his meticulously organized report, along with copies for the board members, the police, and the press. He also carried a small, discreet digital recorder to capture every word of the confrontation. The meeting room, located in the community center, was sparsely furnished, with folding chairs arranged in rows facing a long table where Karen and the other board members sat. Karen, dressed in her usual power suit, a bright red blazer, and a tightly cinched skirt, was already holding court, lecturing a small group of residents about the importance of maintaining community standards. She had a way of making even the most mundane topics sound like matters of life and death. Jack took a seat in the back row, observing the scene, waiting for his moment. He noticed a few of his neighbors, the ones who had shared their stories of Karen's harassment, sitting near the front, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. They knew something was coming, but they didn't know exactly what. The meeting began with the usual formalities, the reading of the minutes, the treasurer's report, delivered by Karen herself, with a smug assurance that bordered on arrogance, and a discussion of upcoming community events. Jack listened patiently, biding his time, letting Karen dig her own grave. Finally, under new business, Karen announced, "We have received several complaints about Mr. Stratton's non-compliance with HOA regulations." She paused, her eyes flicking towards Jack, a hint of malicious satisfaction in her gaze. "We need to discuss the appropriate disciplinary action." This was his cue. Jack stood up, his voice calm but firm. "Madam President," he said, "I believe I have something to say about that." Karen's smile tightened. "Mr. Stratton," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "this is a board meeting. Residents are allowed to observe, but they are not permitted to speak unless recognized by the chair." "I understand," Jack said, ignoring her attempt to silence him. "But I believe I have information that is relevant to this discussion, information that may shed some light on the true nature of these so-called violations." He walked to the front of the room, placing his briefcase on the table. He looked at Karen, then at the other board members, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Before we discuss my alleged violations," he said, "I'd like to present some evidence of a different kind of violation. A violation of trust, a violation of the law, and a violation of the basic principles of decency and fairness." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. He handed a copy to each of the board members, then turned to address the room. "What I have here," he said, his voice rising slightly, "is evidence of a systematic pattern of fraud, extortion, and harassment, perpetrated by the very person who is supposed to be upholding the rules of this community." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. Karen's face had gone pale, her smug expression replaced by a look of dawning panic. "For the past several weeks," Jack continued, "I have been investigating Karen Doyle's activities as HOA president, and what I have discovered is shocking." He then proceeded to lay out his case, methodically, meticulously, presenting the evidence he had gathered. He showed them the fabricated violation notices, the inflated fines, the threats of legal action. He showed them the background checks on Rick and Doug, the HOA enforcement officers, revealing their criminal records and their lack of any legitimate law enforcement credentials. He showed them the financial records, highlighting the suspicious transactions, the missing funds, the evidence of embezzlement. He explained how Karen had used her position to target vulnerable homeowners, to intimidate them into paying bogus fines, and even in some cases to force them out of their homes. He described her tactics of manipulation, her lies, her threats, her complete disregard for the law. As he spoke, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The initial skepticism and apprehension gave way to shock, anger, and a growing sense of outrage. The neighbors who had been silent for so long, fearing Karen's retaliation, now began to murmur amongst themselves, their voices rising in a chorus of disbelief and condemnation. Karen, realizing that she was losing control, tried to interrupt him, to deny the accusations, to claim that it was all a misunderstanding. But her words were drowned out by the growing chorus of voices demanding answers, demanding justice. "Enough," Jack said, his voice cutting through the noise. He held up his hand, and the room fell silent again. He turned to Karen, his eyes locking with hers. "Karen Doyle," he said, his voice low and steady, "you have abused your power, you have betrayed the trust of this community, and you have committed serious crimes, and now you're going to face the consequences." He paused, then delivered the final blow. "You see, Karen," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, "you made a mistake. You thought you could intimidate me, that you could bully me into submission. But you picked the wrong target, because I'm not just a homeowner, I'm a United States Marshal." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his badge, holding it up for everyone to see. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispers, and a collective intake of breath filled the room. Karen's face went from pale to ashen. She looked like she was about to faint. "And Karen?" Jack added, his voice now laced with steel. "Those HOA enforcement officers you sent to my house? They're already in custody, charged with impersonating law enforcement officers. And you, Madam President, are next." He nodded towards the door. 2 uniformed police officers, alerted beforehand by Jack, entered the room, their expressions grim. They approached Karen, their handcuffs ready. The sting was complete. The sight of the uniformed officers approaching Karen Doyle was the final, crushing blow. Her carefully constructed facade of authority, her years of intimidation and manipulation, crumbled in an instant. She stared at the handcuffs, then at Jack Stratton, her eyes wide with disbelief and a flicker of something that might have been fear. You can't do this," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I'm the president of the HOA." "You were the president," Jack corrected, his voice calm but firm, "and now you're under arrest." One of the officers stepped forward, his voice professional and devoid of emotion. "Karen Doyle, you have the right to remain silent." He began to recite the Miranda warning, the words echoing through the stunned silence of the meeting room. Karen, for the first time since Jack had known her, looked utterly defeated. She didn't resist as the officers gently but firmly cuffed her hands behind her back. She didn't shout, she didn't argue, she didn't even make eye contact with anyone. She simply stood there, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped, the picture of a broken bully. As the officers led Karen out of the room, the silence that had fallen over the HOA meeting was replaced by a wave of murmurs, whispers, and then, finally, a burst of applause. The residents of Oakwood Terrace, long oppressed by Karen's tyranny, were finally free. They had witnessed justice being served, and they were celebrating. Jack Stratton, standing at the front of the room, watched as Karen was escorted out. He felt a sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered by a sense of sadness. He hadn't enjoyed taking down Karen Doyle. He had simply done what was necessary. He had upheld the law, protected his community, and brought a criminal to justice. He turned to address the remaining board members and residents. "I know this has been a shock," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "But I want to assure you that everything is going to be all right. The authorities are involved, and they will conduct a thorough investigation. Justice will be served." He then explained the steps that would be taken next. The HOA's operations would be temporarily suspended, pending a full audit of its finances. A receiver would be appointed to oversee the transition and ensure that essential services were maintained. All past violations and fines would be reviewed, and any that were found to be illegitimate would be rescinded. Homeowners who had been unfairly targeted by Karen would be given the opportunity to seek restitution. He also emphasized the importance of moving forward, of rebuilding the community, of creating a new HOA that was truly representative of the residents' interests, one that was based on fairness, transparency, and respect. "This is an opportunity," he said, "to build a better community, a stronger community, a community where everyone feels safe, welcome, and valued." The residents responded with enthusiasm. They asked questions, offered suggestions, and expressed their gratitude to Jack for his courage and his leadership. They were ready to move on, to put the dark chapter of Karen Doyle's reign behind them, and to create a new, brighter future for Oakwood Terrace. In the days and weeks that followed, the full extent of Karen Doyle's corruption was revealed. The police investigation uncovered a complex web of financial irregularities, fraudulent transactions, and illegal schemes. Karen had been siphoning HOA funds into her personal accounts, using the association's money to pay for her own lavish lifestyle. She had also been colluding with Rick and Doug, her HOA enforcement officers, to intimidate and extort residents, forcing them to pay bogus fines or risk losing their homes. The local news media picked up the story, turning Karen Doyle into a pariah, a symbol of HOA abuse and corruption. Her face was plastered across newspapers and television screens, her name synonymous with greed and injustice. The bylaw bully, as one headline dubbed her, had become a national laughingstock. Karen was charged with multiple felonies, including fraud, extortion, embezzlement, and impersonating a law enforcement officer. She initially tried to fight the charges, claiming that she was the victim of a witch hunt, that she had only been acting in the best interests of the community. But the evidence against her was overwhelming, and her defense quickly crumbled. Facing the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, Karen eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced set of charges. She was sentenced to several years in prison, ordered to pay restitution to her victims, and permanently barred from holding any position of authority in a homeowners association. Rick and Doug, her accomplices, also pleaded guilty and received shorter prison sentences. The phony security company they worked for was shut down and its assets were seized. The Oakwood Terrace HOA was reformed with new bylaws, a new board of directors, and a new commitment to transparency and fairness. Jack Stratton, though he initially resisted, was persuaded to serve as interim president, guiding the community through the transition and helping to restore trust and confidence. The neighborhood slowly began to heal. The atmosphere of fear and intimidation that had pervaded Oakwood Terrace under Karen's rule dissipated, replaced by a sense of relief, camaraderie, and renewed community spirit. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak out now felt empowered to participate, to share their ideas, and to shape the future of their community. Jack, having completed his unofficial mission, finally felt like he could relax and enjoy his quiet retirement. He had found the peace he was seeking, not by avoiding conflict, but by confronting it head-on. He had used his skills, his knowledge, and his authority to protect his home, his neighbors, and his community. And in doing so, he had reminded everyone that justice, even in the seemingly mundane world of homeowners associations, was always worth fighting for. The sense of safety in the area was restored. And as he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sunset over the now peaceful streets of Oakwood Terrace, he knew that he had made the right choice. He had come looking for a quiet life, but he had found something even more valuable, a community worth defending, and the satisfaction of knowing that he had made a difference. Here's a paragraph, around 100 words, summarizing the lessons of Badge of Honor and applying them to life, suitable for an older adult audience. Badge of Honor reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, and even seemingly quiet communities can harbor injustice. Like Marshal Stratton, we should never underestimate the power of experience and careful observation. Even in retirement, our skills and knowledge remain valuable tools. It's a testament to the importance of standing up for what's right, even when facing seemingly insurmountable odds. Don't let age or circumstance deter you from challenging abuse of power. Your voice matters, and sometimes the quietest life can be interrupted by the need to defend your principles, and that is the best reason to act.